There's a fence post standing in the dry red dirt of West Texas that looks, to anyone driving past on the farm road, like nothing more than a fence post. It is not. Somewhere beneath the rust and the sun-bleached wood is a small piece of the single most consequential piece of hardware in the history of the American West. A strand of wire with two sharp barbs twisted into it every few inches, patented by a farmer in Illinois in 1874 and manufactured into one of the largest personal fortunes of the entire 19th century. The man who built that fortune never lived on the land it fenced. He never drove cattle, never slept in a bunkhouse, never wore spurs. He sold hardware in a small Illinois town, invested in a fence, and used the money to buy an empire in Texas he would visit only a handful of times before he died. What that fence built, and what eventually cut it down to a fraction of its size, is a story almost nobody outside the Texas Panhandle and South Plains has ever heard. If you're new here, this channel covers the American cities that rose, fell, and are still living with the consequences today. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. This is the story of the Spade Ranch, and it begins not in Texas at all, but in DeKalb, Illinois, with a man named Isaac Ellwood. Born in 1833 in upstate New York, Ellwood spent his boyhood years selling sauerkraut to bargemen along the Erie Canal, then followed the gold rush to California as a young man in 1851. He came home 4 years later with almost $3,000 in his pocket and opened a hardware and farm implement store in DeKalb, a modest Illinois farming town that would, within 2 decades, become the epicenter of one of the most important inventions in American agricultural history. Ellwood married, started a family, and began investing in farmland around DeKalb, and it was that farmland and the constant expensive problem of fencing it that set the entire chain of events in motion. In the 1870s, a DeKalb neighbor named Joseph Glidden had been experimenting with a design for wire fencing that used 2 strands twisted together with sharp barbs woven in at regular intervals, a design cheap enough and effective enough to finally solve the fencing problem that had plagued American farmers and ranchers for a century. Ellwood had been tinkering with a competing barbed wire design of his own, but rather than fight Glidden for the patent, he did something far shrewder. He partnered with him. The 2 men formed a company to manufacture and market Glidden's barbed wire design, and the timing could not have been better. The American West in the 1870s and 80s was a landscape defined by the absence of fences, a place where cattle roamed freely across open range and boundary disputes were settled, often violently, by whoever controlled the most water and the most guns. Barbed wire changed that almost overnight. It was cheap to produce, easy to transport, and for the first time in American history, made it possible to enclose enormous stretches of land with a fraction of the labor and cost that wooden fencing or stone walls had always required. Glidden eventually sold out his stake in the business, keeping only a royalty on future sales, and Ellwood continued manufacturing and marketing the wire, building a fortune that would soon dwarf anything either man could have imagined when they first started twisting metal together in a DeKalb blacksmith shop. By the late 1880s, Ellwood was one of the wealthiest men in Illinois, and he had begun looking for a new place to put that wealth to work, a place where he could demonstrate on a truly massive scale exactly what his product could do. He found it in West Texas. The late 1880s had been brutal for Texas cattlemen, a stretch of catastrophic droughts and killing blizzards that bankrupted operations across the state and left even established ranching families desperate to sell. Among them were brothers Dudley and John Snyder, who had built the Renderbrook Ranch in Mitchell County into a sprawling operation of more than 300,000 acres across 4 counties by 1887, only to be caught in the same collapse that was ruining ranchers all around them. In 1889, Ellwood bought them out, acquiring the Renderbrook Ranch along with roughly 800 head of cattle and a distinctive brand shaped like a spade, originally used by an earlier, smaller outfit whose rights Ellwood had also absorbed. 2 years later, in 1891, he purchased an additional 128,000 acres from the Snyder brothers northwest of what would become Lubbock, and this time, he did something that turned the entire property into a living advertisement for the invention that had made him rich. He fenced the whole thing, all 128,000 acres of it, with 6 strands of his own barbed wire, subdivided into 40-section pastures that let his managers rotate cattle with a precision that open-range ranching had never allowed. Every fence post on the Spade Ranch was, quite literally, a sales pitch standing in the West Texas dirt. The ranch kept growing through the turn of the century. Ellwood added 45,000 acres in 1902 and more in 1906, bringing the combined Spade holdings to 265,000 acres and his total Texas land holdings, across all his properties, to nearly 400,000. He installed telephone lines across the ranch decades before most rural Americans had access to one, put automobiles to work on a property still associated in the popular imagination with horses and cattle drives, and built a reputation as one of the most technically progressive cattle operations in the entire American West, run with the same relentless efficiency that had made his wire business a success. And through all of it, Ellwood himself remained a resident of DeKalb, Illinois, visiting his Texas empire only occasionally, running one of the largest privately held cattle operations in the country almost entirely by remote control, trusting his hired managers to execute a vision he set from more than 1,000 miles away. Ellwood died in DeKalb in September of 1910, having built, from a fence design he did not even invent, one of the largest privately owned land holdings in Texas history. His sons, William Leonard and Irwin Perry Ellwood, inherited the operation and continued running it largely as their father had, fencing new pastures, and in 1919 making a significant change to the herd itself, replacing the original cattle stock with Herefords, a breed better suited to the punishing dry heat of the South Plains than the Longhorn Cross cattle the ranch had run for its first 3 decades. For a few more years, the Spade Ranch continued as it always had, an enormous, tightly managed cattle operation covering a landscape most Americans back east would never see. Then came the mechanism that would shrink the Spade Ranch far more dramatically than any drought or market crash ever had, the agricultural land boom of the 1920s. The very technology that had built the Spade Ranch, cheap and effective fencing, was also one of the key tools that made large-scale commercial farming possible on the South Plains, and by the early 1920s, cotton farming was exploding across the region that the Spade Ranch occupied. Land that had been worth a few dollars an acre as open cattle range was suddenly worth $40 or $50 an acre as farmland, and the Ellwood family, like so many other big Texas ranching operations of the era, faced an economic reality that no amount of loyalty to the cattle business could overcome. The land was worth vastly more broken into farms and sold to settlers than it was worth grazing cattle. Isaac Ellwood himself had reportedly told his son years earlier that he might not live to see it, but the day was coming when this same West Texas land would be farmed and fetching $40 to $50 an acre. He was right, and his own family became one of the primary sellers when that day arrived. The sell-off began in earnest in 1924, when the northern portion of the Spade Ranch was put up for sale, and the ranch's headquarters, which had originally sat in Lamb County, was relocated to a new site further south after the farmland around the old headquarters had been sold out from under it. That October, 6,300 head of cattle were sold off the northern range in a single transaction, followed shortly after by another 5,200 head. By 1926, roughly 80% of the ranch's northern pasture, the same land Isaac Ellwood had fenced with 6 strands of wire in 1891 as a demonstration of his own invention, had been sold, subdivided, and turned into cotton farms. The town of Spade, Texas, still standing today, was founded directly on former Spade Ranch land during exactly this period, a small farming community carved out of what had once been one continuous cattle empire. The process continued for 2 more decades. By 1947, the colonization of the old Spade Ranch lands was essentially complete, and the Ellwood estate retained just 21,754 acres in Hockley County of what had once been a 265,000-acre operation, a reduction of well over 90% from the ranch's peak. This is the mechanism worth sitting with for a moment, because it is different from almost every other great ranch collapse story in Texas history. The Spade Ranch was not destroyed by drought, by falling cattle prices, by an estate tax bill, or by a family feud. It was undone by the success of the exact economic transformation its own founder's invention had helped make possible. Barbed wire did not just build cattle empires in the 1880s and 90s. It also, a generation later, made it economically and physically feasible to fence, plow, and farm the same land those empires had once run cattle across. And when cotton prices rose high enough to make South Plains farmland worth 10 or 20 times what it was worth. As open range, the Ellwood family did exactly what any rational landowner would do. They sold the northern pastures to farmers and pocketed a fortune far larger than decades of cattle sales could ever have produced. Isaac Ellwood built his empire by selling the tool that closed the open range. His own heirs shrank that empire almost to nothing by selling the very land that tool had once enclosed, to the farmers whose arrival his invention had quietly made inevitable. What is easy to miss in a story about a ranch shrinking from 400,000 acres to 21,000 is that the Spade name and the Ellwood family did not actually disappear from Texas ranching at all. While the northern pastures around Lubbock were being carved into cotton farms throughout the 1920s and 40s, the original core of the operation, the Renderbrook Ranch south of Colorado City in Mitchell County, the property Ellwood had bought first, back in 1889, before he ever fenced a single acre near Lubbock, remained in the family's hands and kept running Spade-branded cattle straight through the 20th century. The Ellwood descendants continued innovating on that surviving core the same way Isaac Ellwood once had, installing modern breeding technology, including embryo transplantation programs in the 1970s, decades before that kind of genetic management was common in the cattle industry. In 1970, the family donated the historic Renderbrook Spade blacksmith shop to the Ranching Heritage Association in Lubbock, where it became one of the very first buildings reassembled at what is now the Ranching Heritage Center. A small, deliberate act of preserving the operation's origins even as its geography kept shifting. Today, more than 135 years after Isaac Ellwood first registered the Spade brand, his descendants still own and operate ranching land under that same name, though the map looks nothing like it did in 1910. The Renderbrook Spade still anchors the operation in Mitchell, Sterling, and Coke counties, joined now by a North Spade division in Motley and Hall counties, a Panhandle Spade in Roberts and Hemphill counties, and an Alpine Spade far to the southwest in Brewster and Presidio counties, together totaling roughly 275,000 acres spread across parts of Texas that Isaac Ellwood himself likely never visited in his lifetime. The empire is not the single, continuous quarter-million-acre block it was in 1910. It is instead a scattered federation of properties, rebuilt and repositioned by 5 generations of the same family, still running cattle under the Spade-shaped brand a barbed wire salesman from Illinois first burned into cowhide in 1889. The fence posts that remain standing on what is now farmland around Lubbock tell only half the story. They mark where an Illinois hardware store owner turned his own invention into one of the largest cattle empires in Texas, fencing off West Texas with wire nobody else could manufacture as cheaply or as well. But the real story of the Spade Ranch is what happened after that fence went up. The same economic force that let Ellwood enclose the open range eventually made it more profitable to tear that enclosure apart and sell it to farmers, and his own family, the very people who inherited the empire he built, were the ones who sold it off, parcel by parcel, because the numbers told them to. What survives today is not the empire Isaac Ellwood built. It is what his descendants managed to save from the boom his own invention helped create, spread now across 5 Texas counties, still carrying a brand shaped like the tool that started it all. If you want to see the next American fortune that quietly consumed itself, subscribe, because the wire on that story is already being strung.